This next segment deals with interesting mammalian reproductive strategies, things that are outside the typical sequence of events that we see across lots of mammal species. So the typical sequence starts with copulation. Usually ovulation comes after copulation, and then fertilization happens shortly thereafter. After the egg is fertilized, it starts to divide, 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells, and so on. And a little while down the line, after it reaches a couple hundred cells, it implants in the female's uterus, and pregnancy proceeds from there. And after a period of time that depends on the species, the offspring is born. And we have several variants to this typical strategy. The first is delayed fertilization, and it's just what the name implies. You have copulation, so the male and the female mate. The male transfers sperm to the female, but instead of ovulating right away, the female stores the sperm inside her uterus and fallopian tubes for a period of time. And after a while, fertilization occurs, ovulation occurs, and the whole rest of the cascade happens. Where we see this exclusively, the only mammals we see this in are bats. And the thing that's going on with bats, they're very small in body size. So remember, small body sized animals have an unfavorable surface area to volume ratio. Their surface area is high relative to their volume. And that means that in cold environments, they lose their internal heat very quickly to the environment. A lot of bat species are found in temperate areas that get kind of cold in the winter, and a lot of them feed on insects, which are not active in the winter time. So in the winter time, bats get cold very fast, and to stay warm all winter, they would need lots of energy, lots of food to be able to stay warm, but they don't have that luxury. There's no food flying around for them to catch and eat. So they're in a situation where they have to conserve energy, and so they go into hibernation. They use hypothermia to lower their energy demands during a time when food is very, very scarce. So the females are copulating in the fall, right before they go into hibernation. They're storing sperm during hibernation, and when they warm up from hibernation in the springtime, that's when fertilization happens, and that's when they ovulate and the offspring are born very early in the spring. Now, why not just copulate in the spring? A lot of species do that. It turns out that it's very, very critical for the offspring to be born as quickly as possible when spring comes around, because they need the advantage of a very long feeding season to put enough body fat to be able to survive the winter. So the later they're born in the season, the less likely they're going to be fat enough to survive the upcoming winter. If the bats were to wait until the males could gear up sperm production, that would delay ovulation and fertilization. So instead, the males produce the sperm in the fall, the females store the sperm, and then they can give birth much early in the season than if the males had to start making sperm. Making sperm takes a lot more time than the development of an egg, so it would delay the birth of those offspring by several weeks, which would leave them perhaps unable to survive the winter hibernation. The second unusual strategy is delayed implantation. And in this case, we have copulation, ovulation, fertilization happens, the embryo starts to develop, it gets to about 100 to 400 cells, and then instead of implanting, it just floats around inside the uterus and sits there in a state of dormancy. It's not dividing anymore, it's just sort of in suspended animation for a little while. The period of dormancy can last anywhere from about 12 days or so up until 11 months. And that varies from species to species. It could also vary very drastically within a species. Once that period of dormancy is over, the embryo implants in the uterus and everything else proceeds as in the normal situation. There are lots of species that have delayed implantation. So some examples are bats, sloths and anteaters, carnivores, some of the hoofstock, artiodactyls, marsupials have a form of delayed implantation. So this happens in situations where the environmental conditions are either unpredictable or they're seasonally inconducive to having offspring. So in the unpredictable condition, the idea is that the female is carrying around a partially developed offspring, and she's going to wait to let that offspring implant until she can predict that it will be born in a time when there are sufficient resources for it to survive. We don't exactly know how this works out, how females know that the environment is improving enough for pregnancy to continue. There are probably signals that they're picking up from environmental signals, maybe some plant signals that indicate that the plants are growing. We don't really know what cues there are. In the other situations, sometimes it's sort of pre-programmed because the development cycle for the embryos is out of sync with the environment cycle. And we see this happening in seals and sea lions. They mate at the same time every year during a very short period of time where they're mating, they're molting out their old coat of hair and growing in a new coat of hair, and they're also giving birth to offspring. Within a period of a few days, all these things are happening. And during this time, they're out of the water, right? When the offspring are born, they're not born in the water, they're born on land. They stay on land for the first few days or weeks before they're old enough to go out and swim around with their parents. So during this time, there's a very specific time when the offspring need to be born every 12 months. But the period of development is much less than 12 months, right? So they're copulating at the same time as they're giving birth, or shortly after they give birth, they're copulating. But instead of development happening at a normal pace right from that point, there's this period of dormancy that allows the offspring to be finished 12 months down the road at the time when the seals and sea lions are out on dry land. Then we have a situation called delayed development. And this is sort of similar to delayed implantation, but the dormancy happens at a slightly different phase of the reproductive cycle. So you have copulation, fertilization, you do have implantation, so development goes a little bit further, but then you have a dormancy period where after it's implanted in the uterus, it just stops developing and waits. And then somewhere down the line, you have resumption of development that leads down the line to birth. The only mammals that we know of this happening in are bats. And as I said right at the beginning of the semester, anytime I ask you what kind of animal does something weird, you're almost always safe to say bats. Bats are the only ones that do delayed fertilization, and they're the only ones that do delayed development. And we don't exactly know why they do delayed development instead of delayed implantation. It's the end result is very, very similar, and probably the advantages to doing this are very similar. It's a matter of being able to time the birth of offspring to when the resources are most conducive to the survival of that offspring. Embryonic diapause is sort of the kangaroo version of delayed implantation, and it gets a separate name for a couple of reasons. So all it means is that the offspring, the embryo, once it starts to develop, stops developing for a period of time and is dormant for a while, and then eventually it'll start developing again. The reason it gets a special name is twofold. One is because the marsupials don't really have implantation, so calling it delayed implantation is a little bit of sloppy terminology. You have the early development and dormancy, but it doesn't really implant in the uterus. It just sort of settles next to the uterus when it starts developing again and throughout the rest of that cycle. The other reason that embryonic diapause gets a special name is because of the way that kangaroos use embryonic diapause. It's basically a way of having an offspring on reserve for when the timing is right to continue development. So we know what the trigger is. It's when the older offspring either dies or is weaned, that's when the younger offspring starts to develop again. So at any given point in time, a kangaroo might have an older offspring that's out of the pouch but still taking milk here and there, an offspring that's in the pouch full time and is also taking milk, and then an embryo that's in a stage of dormancy in the female's uterus. And once that the older offspring is fully weaned, that's a cue for the embryo that's in dormancy to start developing again. Or if the offspring in the pouch were to die, that also would be a cue for the embryo that's dormant to start developing again. Finally, we have a situation known as spontaneous abortion, and we see this in a bunch of species of rodents. And what happens here is that a female will copulate and ovulate, and fertilization will happen, and the embryos will start to develop, but soon after they start developing, they are spontaneously ejected from the uterus. So it's an abortion that happens spontaneously based on the female encountering the scent of a strange male. What's interesting about this is it doesn't happen every time a female encounters a strange male. Only if she encounters a strange male or the scent of a strange male and the male she mated with is no longer around. Even though they don't live in close proximity in most species of rodents, in many species they share the same home range. So they're traveling in the same areas and they encounter each other. If not in person, they encounter each other's smells. And as long as the female who's pregnant is still encountering the smell of the male she mated with, she keeps carrying those developing embryos. But if she stops encountering his smell and instead encounters a strange male, she'll abort the litter that she's carrying. It turns out that rodents of a lot of species are infanticidal. So if she went through with the pregnancy and gave birth to live young, they would be doomed because the male that is in that area would kill them. And the reason he'd kill them is because that would cause the female to come back into estrus and mate again and have his litter. So instead of another male's litter growing up in his home range, he would have his own litter growing up in that home range. There's no advantage to the female in this situation other than she would invest a little bit less of her resources in offspring that are doomed to die. So it's not an advantage to her to give up offspring that she already has developing in her uterus, but since they inevitably would be killed or almost certainly killed by the new male, she's better off cutting her losses and starting over again with the new male as opposed to going through with the entire pregnancy only to start again and have another set of offspring that might not survive through the year because they would be born late.